thanks very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming out tonight to, for those of you who don't know anything about Kasper Hauser, to hear about him. Is there anybody really for whom this is a completely blank slate? Please show. Great, and that helps me. Good. And for those of you who do know something, then I hope at least I can say something that can open up some new perspectives for you on this issue. Because it's a fascinating question. It's not only a kind of a first-rate thriller in the sense of a whodunit, but it's also a serious geopolitical issue. It's something which, although it happened 180 years ago, has, I feel, direct relevance to what's going on right now today. And I'm going to start with today, and I'll finish up with today. It's also a deeply moving story, very human story, because, as Sean said, the other aspect of the story, the original title was Kasper Hauser, Identity and Evil and the Future of Europe. So the identity and the evil are also going to be in there. That will become very clear. Because this particular individual, when he finally died at the age of 21, he had suffered from various kinds of evil. And the question of evil today in our modern world is a really serious issue which is facing us with increasing intensity as each year goes by, I feel. And in a certain sense, what happened to him is we could say it's a certain, almost a template, if I could use that word, for how the forces of evil actually work. But it's not only Kasper Hauser as a victim. The question is what Kasper Hauser actually came to do in his life. What was his task, you could say, and how was that frustrated? What was this task that he came to do? And what's its relevance to Europe today? So that's where I'll start. And just a couple of quotes. One I particularly like from the novel by George Orwell, 1984. Those who control the past control the future. And those who control the present control the past. So in other words, if you're in a position to tell a nation what its history has been, where it has been, where it is now, and where it is going, then you are in a position to, as it were, guide the nation. And that could be in a positive sense or a negative sense. So certainly that's happening in my own country, in Britain, where our politicians tell us, well, this has been what our nation has been about since, for example, let's say the time of Henry VIII. And this, therefore, is how we need to go on into the future. And the use of history in the telling of the national story through the school system, for example, is a very important part of that. And then how that gets ramified out into the media, how these messages are communicated in various ways. Yeah? So that's the one point I just draw your attention to. And the story of Kasper Hauser, as we'll see, really relates to how, in this case, the Germans are being told a certain story about their past right now, today. And Rudolf Steiner pointed out, the Austrian spiritual scientist, back in the beginning of the 20th century, he said that people always affirm only what is present, and they do not pay due attention to what is absent. So in other words, we look at the people who are active in the cultural or political or whatever it is, scientific life, but we tend not to look at, well, what happens when somebody or some element is missing? Perhaps somebody or some element has been removed in some way. What then are the consequences when you have something which should have been and then is taken away? What results from that? These days, historians often like to talk about this in terms of what they call counterfactuals. In other words, imagining what-ifs. When I studied history at Manchester in the early 70s, historians were absolutely against that. Nobody did that. But today, this whole question of historical imagination is much more respectable in historical circles. Because when you start to imagine what if, then you realize that there are other alternatives. There were other alternatives in the life of either an individual or the life even of a nation. Other paths that a culture could have taken in its destiny. Yeah? And then you realize that if there are those other paths, you can see what mistakes an individual or a nation makes in its biography at certain particular crucial crossroads, you might say. And then how that nation or how that individual could understand that if it can become aware of them, and then perhaps either return to that point in a sense, or at least realize how that option in a certain sense is still open to it and can take it up again and therefore heal itself, heal himself, heal herself. So that's what Stein is pointing to here, is the importance of noticing what happens when in the history of a nation an individual, for example, or a phenomenon suddenly goes missing. And I'm sure we can all recognize that in history, in the histories of many countries, there have been key individuals who've clearly greatly affected the history of a nation. One can think of, say, in the history of my own country, William the Conqueror, or France, Joan of Arc, obviously Napoleon. Yeah? And I'm sure you'll be able to think of similar individuals in the history of Ireland. So, certain individuals, by the roles they play, or by the fact that they were, perhaps, as I said before, taken out prematurely, has a great effect on the subsequent history of that country. And this was certainly the case with Kasper Hauser. So I'm going to start by talking about the European situation now and then, in his time. As Sean said, it's his 200th anniversary this year. He was born in 1812, he died in 1833. And then I'll speak about the attacks upon this individuality, which are still ongoing, both in Germany, which is where he first appeared in 1812, and also in the English-speaking world. And this is a very interesting thing, why this individual is still being attacked in the English-speaking world so much later than his own life. Then I'll speak a bit about the place where he suddenly appeared into the world and where he was on the world stage, where the world got to know him, namely the city of Nuremberg in Bavaria, and the meaning and significance of this place. And then I'll go through the story of Kasper itself, and then, as Sean said, then we'll take a break. And then I'll come in after the break to say something about the role of a very key individual in this story, an English aristocrat by the name of Philip Henry Stanhope, the 4th Earl of Stanhope. And when I got to know about this story of Kasper Hauser in the 1980s, through actually my interest in trying to understand the causes of the First World War, and trying to see what were the origins of the First World War, which I felt was somehow the crucible, you could say, of the 20th century into which I had been born, and I wanted to know what was this 20th century. So in seeking to try and understand these causes, I went back into the 19th century. That's when I came across the story of Kasper Hauser. And then I was fascinated to see that in this story an Englishman played a key role. Well, the other day I came across a Persian history book, and in this Persian history book it said that under every leaf in the course of history you will find an Englishman. Which is part of this sort of Persian conspiracy theory of history. The English are behind everything that happens in the world, you know. Well, you could excuse people in Ireland for thinking that as well. And there is a certain amount of truth in this, certainly in the last, say, several hundred years. So here, in this story, you'll see that an Englishman again plays a crucial role, and it's not a very pleasant one. And then lastly, I'll speak about this question of the relationship between the German-speaking and the English-speaking world, and about Kasper Hauser and the future of Europe specifically. Okay, so to start with where we are now, tomorrow, 28th of June. Does anybody know why the 28th of June is an important date in modern history? Barry? Assassination of
Franz Ferdinand.
Right. Assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, which was actually the spark that started the First World War in 1914. Yeah? 28th of June, happened in Sarajevo. There's another reason, 28th of June. Anybody know that? First World War started in 1914, First World War ended in 1918, but the peace treaty of Versailles, the controversial peace treaty of Versailles, was signed the following year in Versailles on the 28th of June. Okay, so the First World War began and in a certain sense ended with the 28th of June. And tomorrow, this gentleman, President of the European Commission, Manuel Barroso, and the President of the European Council, Rompuy, are going to present their latest thoughts on the future direction of Europe on this date. And basically they're going to tell us in this calendar or roadmap about their plans for more European integration, and this will lead to full economic union, Barroso said on the 30th of May. They're looking to complete the process of economic and monetary union by having fiscal integration. That will mean centralised supranational control over the budgetary and taxational policies of independent nations.